From the beautiful city of Los Angeles, California, we bring you the Gimme Three Podcast.
Welcome back, cinephiles, cinema lovers, movie appreciators, and our family and friends to the Gimme Three Podcast, a series for cinephiles. I'm Bella Efstratis, co-host of the Gimme Three Podcast with the amazing Nicholas Ibarra. For all Nick's wonderful fans out there, trust me, I miss him too, and I'm very excited to announce that he will be returning to the podcast next week with two very special guests. So stay tuned for another exciting episode with Nick. As our listeners know, over the past few weeks, I've been joined by a handful of incredible guests that were generous enough to come and talk on the show with me. And today I'm going to be joined by yet another amazing guest. This man is a true cinephile. I'm talking gets the framed every single day in one kind of cinephile. Introducing Matt Cochran, everyone.
Hey, y'all, happy to be here. Really great honor. I got some big shoes to fill that I think I'll only get a fraction filled, but really excited to be a part of this.
Welcome, Matt. It's so nice to have you here on the podcast today, and thank you so much for joining me. Genuinely, I'm so excited for today. Matt and I wanted to bring you guys a bit of a niche theme today. As you can see, we've titled this episode "The War Within: America's Love-Hate Relationship with War." So you may be asking, like, what exactly does that entail? Well, at first we were going to do Gimme Three war films, but that felt way too broad. So we were like, let's narrow this down to anti-war films. And then as we were going through some options, we realized that there are actually quite a few anti-war films that walk a thin line of being anti-war and not so anti-war, maybe even glorifying its characters, the soldier experience, or the battlefield itself. So today we wanted to bring you guys 3 anti-war movies handpicked by Matt himself. Thank you very much, Matt. And discuss some of the ways thematically or even stylistically that these films ultimately undermine themselves a little bit. While these 3 films arguably set out with anti-war messages and intentions, there are certain scenes or dialogue or moods and tones even that may ultimately subvert this message. So for our lineup today, Matt has selected Full Metal Jacket, Jarhead, and The Hurt Locker. 3 amazing films, I must say. I'm curious, Matt, were there any other glorified kind of anti-war films that you were debating on choosing for this theme?
Yeah, at one point I was heavily considering Apocalypse Now, and then I felt like that movie plays so much in this psychological thriller and is definitely a criticism of the Vietnam War, but in many cases that doesn't take center stage. And I also think just talking about that movie kind of requires its own time and care, and I felt like that might step on the toes of the theme.
Yeah, and we got bits and pieces of it in a certain film today that we'll be discussing as well. So in a way, it's here with us regardless. Yeah, it was. I will say before we jump in, it was really interesting to watch these films with our theme in mind, because it did kind of affect the way I watched or enjoyed the films. Going into them with the mindset of okay, this is an anti-war film, and then looking out for this kind of subversive messages made this kind of complicated, but also a lot of fun, I will say. I don't know. How was it for you watching these movies, having almost an assignment behind the viewing experience, if you will?
Well, my favorite of these 3 movies is Jarhead, and I've always felt like the message is a little bit undermined in that movie, and we'll get to it more. But that was something I always wanted to explore, and I felt like the other 2 really followed this trajectory. And funny enough, I did want to remind myself what just a pure American pro-war film looks like. So At one point, I watched the helicopter scene from the first Michael Bay Transformers movie, and I watched, I think, 20 minutes of the A-Team remake last night while I was making dinner, just because it showed up on my Prime, and I was like, you know what, fine, I'll toss that on. So there is definitely a real distinction. There's a Top Gun out there that is just pure pro-American war. And then there are these movies that have always fascinated me a lot more that definitely don't like the American idea of war as almost a business, a perpetual cycle that has to kind of remain in the collective consciousness, and critiques it, but at the same time, while critiquing it and framing it to be profitable for American audiences, loses a lot of that message because America, famously so, really loves their war movies.
Yeah.
And, I'm not an exception to that. I also love them. That's why we're doing this.
Yeah.
But it is interesting to see how making an entertaining movie and also having your criticisms in sometimes cancels each other out to an extent.
It's so true. I'm so glad you made that point. And I think the three films that we picked today really work for like what we're trying to go for today, basically. So I'm excited too, because we haven't really talked about them until now together, even though we've been watching them over the course of the week. So it'll be fun to hear your thoughts on all of them and like all that kind of stuff. So without further ado, let's jump into our first film of the day. Up first is Stanley Kubrick's iconic 1987 war film Full Metal Jacket, which I learned was actually his last film released during his lifetime. I guess he had passed just before Eyes Wide Shut was released. Kubrick wrote the screenplay with Michael Eyre and Gustav Hasford. He knew he wanted to make a war film. At first, he thought about making a film about the Holocaust, but after discovering Hasford's novel The Short Timers, which was a 1979 autobiographical novel about his experience in Vietnam, he decided he wanted to adapt that into a movie instead. So this film had a pretty small budget of just $16 million, which I thought was pretty crazy. And it went on to gross $120 million and received an Oscar nom for Best Adapted Screenplay. So it's gone down in cinematic history ever since. I feel like even if you're not necessarily a cinephile, you've probably heard of this movie or even watched it, honestly. I feel like it's one of the most famous war movies ever made, and it inspired so many more war films to come, even some that we have on our lineup for today. So the film stars Matthew Modine, Arlie Ermy, Vincent D'Onofrio, Adam Baldwin, Dorian Harewood, and Arliss Howard as a group of young Marines. We follow the group through the brutal training of boot camp and the harrowing realities of combat in Vietnam. From beginning to end, the film reveals the extreme psychological toll and dehumanizing effects of war on its soldiers. Before I dive into more of my initial thoughts on Full Metal Jacket, Matt, what did you think of this film? Had you seen it before this?
So what's funny is the first time I ever watched this movie, I came in about 30 minutes into the runtime, maybe 45 minutes.
Oh, okay.
And one of my roommates from college had been watching it, Will King, who some of the viewers may know and love. Now, Will had it, and he had gone past the drill sergeant scene, which is by far the most iconic part of this movie. And I hopped in and I started watching, but I started from the very beginning of the Vietnam section of the movie till the end. And I didn't see the beginning drill instructor scenes until maybe a year after that.
Oh, wow.
I think this might have been 2 years ago. So it's weird. When I first saw this movie, I got spoon-fed the less iconic part of the movie, but I think that part of the movie also holds a lot of meat that in pop culture definitely gets forgotten a lot.
Yeah.
But growing up, I always knew a lot about this movie. My grandpa was actually in the Marines and was in Vietnam. And my mom has this funny story because he didn't really talk too much about it. But she has this funny story of she saw the movie with him. And after they were leaving, the only thing he said was, that was a realistic drilling sergeant. That's what they were like. That's the only comment he really made about it. And I'm sure that's a story that's been a little embellished over the years, right. But I've always thought that was a funny tidbit.
That is actually hilarious, especially because watching that scene, I watched this movie with Remy, who we've had on the podcast as well, good friend of ours, and that scene, as like horrible and abusive as it is, we were both kind of like laughing, like it's kind of funny, especially like Leonard, when he's like up in Leonard's face. That's his name, right? I'm blanking. And he's like, he's trying not to laugh. We were both just dying. We were like, how could he not laugh? Like, honestly, the shit that's coming out of this guy's mouth, it's ridiculous.
Holy Jesus. What is that? What the fuck is that? What is that, Private pile.
Sir, jelly donut, sir!
A jelly donut?
Sir, yes, sir!
Yeah, this movie, I think, paved the way for like crazy drill instructor scenes. And a lot of movies, Jarhead, which we will talk about,
Yep.
definitely draw some parallels.
Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, I'll say right off the bat, like, I watched this after Jarhead. May have been a mistake because I was like, these are the same movies. But we'll talk more about that later. Sorry, what were you gonna say?
I was just like, this becomes heralded as this is the drill instructor scene.
Mhm.
This gets like, I mean, this is taken in everything. I'm pretty sure the Penguins of Madagascar parody at one point.
Probably.
Like it's incredible how the scene before the war in this famous war movie becomes much more iconic than the actual war movie, which I think in of itself is also very fascinating. And I know, I was talking to a coworker about this a few days ago, and and I said I was watching Full Metal Jacket tonight when I got home, and he was like, "Oh, nice, the first 25 minutes." And I was like, "No, actually, funny enough, the whole movie."
Oh, really? That's so funny.
So it sounds like there is this kind of idea that like, yeah, the movie's mostly the drill instructor sergeant scene.
That's so fascinating. I never would have I honestly didn't know that. I never would have guessed that because I feel like at the same time though, hearing that, it is so clear that there are like two parts of this film. Like you said,
Yes.
the drill sergeant and then the actual war, like being out there in the field. And they do feel very separate, even like stylistically. I feel like that first half, cinematography wise, I was like, no offense, I was bored. I was like, this is not nearly as entertaining as the other movies we've got today. It's a lot of just like static shots, mediums, just very simplified, I guess. But then the editing made up for it because like whenever something crazy does happen, it kind of like the camera will jump all around and stuff, and it looks really cool. But then I noticed in the second half, there was so much more like almost POV shots and like shaky camera movement to really like get you into whatever is happening with these characters and whatever spot they're in. And so, yeah, they are almost like two different films in one, but they still have like a clear connection, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this really great way where the first movie is molding someone into a soldier, into a killer, and you can really hear how the language changes.
Yeah.
And I can't remember. There's the scene in the bathroom where they're mopping up the bathroom, and almost half the conversation sounds foreign because they're using marine lingo,
Right.
which is. It's very much about what the purpose of an object is. It's not actually about what the object is in of itself, its inherent quality. And so I think that's really interesting because then you jump into the war scenes of the movie, and that is just straight. There is another language to combat. And then you start to see towards the end how that language affects how you actually view the horrific acts that are taking place. And, I think language is very important in this film. It's very important in Jarhead on how people kind of rationalize some of the violence. There's that really notable scene where they're in the helicopter and the gunner is firing off at the civilians. And he makes the comment, and I don't think this is from this movie. Don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure this was like a thing said in Vietnam that was if they're running away, they're Viet Cong, and if they're standing still, they're well-disciplined Viet Cong. So just a lot of the idea of how language justifies these acts and how people kind of hide behind this militaristic lingo.
Oh my God, I love that. Yeah, it's so true. And like, that was something that was really funny watching all these films kind of back to back over the course of this week. I was like, damn, I have a whole new vocabulary. Like, and hearing that, like, clearly there's a lot of authenticity between all three of the films we're talking about today, but in this one particularly, and Jarhead particularly, just because I noticed there were a lot of connections between the two. I was surprised to see just how much of like the lingo hasn't changed between those two wars and all that time. Like, this is my rifle and blah, 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 and stuff like that, where it's like, these are two completely different wars, and yet the culture hasn't shifted at all, which is just mind-boggling to think about.
Yeah, I think it's also, it does help that they're in similar positions in the military in both. But I thought the journalistic aspect of it even shows, like, there's the comment that's like, hey, let the civilian press tell them that we're losing.
Mm-hmm.
People need a reason to think that we're actually winning this thing.
Yeah.
I thought that was really good.
Yeah. Oh my God. And even like, I was really surprised to see kind of like the war journalist aspect of this film. Like, there was one scene that was kind of just the irony was like chilling. And it's when they're standing in front of this like horrible mass grave of like what I'm assuming are civilians, because it's right after that scene. And the guy comes up with the camera to one of the soldiers like working on the spot. And the other guy's asking, Matthew Modine's character is like asking him what happened here. And in between telling the most horrific story, as this guy is snapping pictures, the guy is like smiling at the camera for every shot. And it's such a like twisted, almost comical moment, because you're just like, oh my God, this is so fucked up. Like, I can't believe this is
especially
real.
As he walks away from the grave with his handkerchief over his mouth, turns, and then he immediately reverts to like that press smile.
Yeah.
And it's really awkward to watch because, I mean, it's every 2 seconds he has to smile.
Yeah.
And he looks, he looks really weird doing it.
It's so
totally
weird.
Throws off the vibe. Yeah, so it's so off-putting. He walks away with the handkerchief, and then you just keep seeing the turns to smile, and he's just protecting the image. And I think that's a really strong criticism of especially the Vietnam War, how the war was also, it was so unpopular at this point when the movie is set, where every decision is also being made to say, hey, how can we keep this war going? And I think all three of these movies really deal with this idea of like, all these wars are perpetually never ending. Now, granted, the Gulf War, very short. However, because it comes out in 2005, there's so many clear references to the Iraq War, which was ongoing at that point.
Right.
And there's just this idea that in America, war has to be perpetual. We've basically been, since the end of World War II, locked in some form of conflict somewhere on Earth ever since then. And so this idea of like, even on the smallest scale, standing next to a mass killing in a mass grave, they still have to pretty it up for the PR.
Yeah, it's such a disturbing scene, honestly. Like, but the irony of it was almost like you had to laugh, because you're just like, oh my God, these people are just so far gone, honestly. Like, they've completely dissociated from the reality and like just the horrors of it. And then, just seeing that like dehumanization of these characters over time is it's heartbreaking to watch. It was hard for me, not to like change the subject, but it was hard for me to choose like specific things that were like maybe kind of subverted the message a little bit in this film. But I would say one of the biggest ones for me that I think is in a lot of them that we'll talk about today as well is just like othering the enemy. Like this one specifically, I did take issue with like the way they depicted the Vietnamese and like specifically the prostitute scene. Like, it kind of seemed to like almost like caricaturize them, and like, I don't know, it really rubbed me the wrong way, to be honest. And I felt like, obviously, like, I get that this is probably an accurate depiction for like the very real racism that many American soldiers felt towards Vietnamese during this war, but I think Kubrick could have taken this opportunity to like highlight that, show that, and then, show the opposite side of it. But it really just, I don't know, I feel like it was a big part of why I feel like this movie kind of failed a little bit with like an anti-war message, because it really just focused on like, oh, look how dehumanized these men are, when there's so many more factors at play. You know what I mean?
Yeah. For me, I always felt like what really kind of stomps on the anti-war sentiment of the movie is just how much the movie is eclipsed by the drill sergeant section of it.
Great point.
And just the fact that a lot of this, like what people remember of this movie, this war movie, is not the war.
So true.
But there's another thing that, maybe Kubrick was making this intentional, where was it Adam Baldwin? It's Adam Baldwin in this, right?
Yeah, yeah.
My only note when he came on screen was just, lol, Baldwin brother, jump scare. But so his character is clearly abhorrent, is like genuinely evil. But they make note that everyone puts up with it because he is in fact good at war. He is a killer, and he is actually good at saving the lives of the soldiers around him. There's no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was something that I think it both steps on the message a little bit, but I think is true to war that Kubrick was talking about, which is, in general, when people are in war, a lot of it is just about self-preservation and survival.
Right.
And I think most people are pretty willing to put up with some very, very abhorrent acts if those acts they associate with also saving themselves. And so I think Adam Baldwin's character exists purely to be like, these people will put up with anything so as to not be killed themselves. Now, granted, this is a war where a good number of participants were not particularly willing. They were drafted. And so it really stands out as when there's one guy that clearly wants to fight war and is keeping the people around him alive. I think it is a good point to make that would probably resonate with people that are just there to survive.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
And they would turn a blind eye to everything else.
Yeah. I think that like specifically comes into play maybe in that scene towards the end in the second half, really, where they've had their two guys out in like the middle of the field just constantly being shot at, and they don't have backup coming, and like then that's where like the hierarchy gets like totally flipped of just like you were saying, like, okay, how are we gonna, one of them is kind of more self-preservation, the other's like, fuck this, like this is what we came out here to do, like we got to save these guys, we got to figure out this mission, and it gets just so chaotic from there, honestly.
Yeah, and it gets immediately chaotic. All forms of a hierarchy dissolved like that.
Yeah.
And then it just becomes who can complete the objective, who can kill the enemy more. Yep. And I think Kubrick makes a good point to say like a lot of morals kind of dissolve away when that happens. And you even see that with Matthew Modine starts really Modine? Yeah,
I think so. Yeah. Cool. Sorry, Matthew, if that's wrong.
Our bad. He's clearly abhorred by Baldwin's character in the beginning.
Yeah.
And especially in combat, you see that go away very quickly. And I think that's brought to a head when he kills the child Vietnamese sniper.
Yeah.
Now, I will say in that scene, I think Kubrick was doing his 80s, the 1980s equivalent of his best to humanize the Vietnamese.
Yeah.
When they're like, she's praying. And it's like, yeah, no shit. Other people can pray. Did you just learn that?
Great point.
And I think, so I think that some of this is also the age of the movie, just,
totally. Yeah.
Doesn't age the best that's like the best they can do. But I also think to a broader scale, when people make anti-war movies about American wars that Americans are fighting in, a lot of them go not to show the perspective of the enemy, but to show, look how bad this war is for our boys. Look how shitty this is for them. Why would we send our American boys to fight this war?
Right. Because,
and, I could be wrong. I think I'm not. But I'm sure, especially in the 1980s, if you went to any of the major studios and pitched, I want to make a war movie that criticizes the Vietnam War for a major box office audience, and I would like it to star the Vietnamese, I think you would just be shot down in Hollywood back then. I think you're probably shot down in most rooms in Hollywood today. The Sympathizer is the reason why I am saying most, because The Sympathizer, I think, does a really good job of actually demonstrating from a Vietnamese perspective what America was like and what that war was.
Is that
Not
the
to get
new?
lost in a tangent.
Is that the new TV show with Robert Downey Jr.?
Yes.
And okay,
yes, that's the one where Robert Downey Jr. plays like the 6 faces of American evil.
Yes, very cool. I need to check that one
yes.
out. I've heard good things.
Definitely worth. I think I binged it over the course of 3 separate Monday nights.
Love it.
And was definitely thought that was a movie or a TV show or a story to be told by a major media producer that I didn't expect was going to be coming out of Hollywood.
Yeah.
Even now.
No, that's crazy. I think you're spot on. I think it is important. That was something that was very clear to me watching all these movies. It's very important to think about the time period they were made in, especially considering they're tackling real world events. And a lot of the times based on real people in some of the films we talk about today too. So I think you're absolutely right that there is just like a level of, I don't know if sensitivity is the right word, but almost sensitivity in the sense where it's like there were certain lines that just simply could not be crossed in Hollywood. Yeah. Within the genre.
There was, when you made it up a certain floor at any of the major studios, you know, you were just getting laughed out of the office. And that I think is that is strictly a reality of the time it was back then. I think that's still to an extent a reality of the time, but is maybe getting changed. And also a lot more foreign cinema influence is now reaching American audiences. And I think that's demonstrating the American public's openness to ideas that maybe challenge and critique what they're expecting. Now, granted, the last movie on here, I will say, kind of proves that wrong 10 years ago. So we'll circle back to that.
Yeah, overall, I mean, you know, we're criticizing this. That's what we came here to do. I think Full Metal Jacket is a great movie. I have to say, like,
absolutely, yeah.
I really actually genuinely enjoyed it. But it was almost more fun to watch it with this like task in mind because it just really made me think more critically about it, which is something I may not have done, especially considering I have a thing where if I'm like, okay, this movie is, everyone talks about this movie. It's Stanley Kubrick. Everyone loves Full Metal Jacket. Sometimes I'm like, oh, you know what? That was great. Just because I'm like trying to fit in, you know, I can't be the only person that didn't like Full Metal Jacket. So it was really nice to have this like lens to watch it through because it made me feel more comfortable in like criticizing certain aspects of it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I mean, it is nice knowing, because I think what we're trying to do here is we're critiquing how well someone reached their mission.
Yeah, exactly.
With these movies, and like how well did they critique war, and did they kind of muddy up their message? And I also think a big part of this is not on the director themselves, but the is more about how the American populace responds to the movie. Now, granted, you can like. There's a good question with all art that is, if the artist intended one thing and the entire audience took it the other way, did you fail or is the audience dumb? I'm not here to answer that question.
Yeah, who knows, honestly.
I don't know.
Who are we to judge?
I'm 23 and pretty dumb. I'm not the be all end all. I have no answer to that. But I think, the way this movie is remembered, especially for not being for its criticisms of war, as much as it is remembered for the intro drill sergeant and just how, impactful and, frankly, funny lines he has.
Yeah.
And so I think, it is fun to set out with these movies. And, none of these movies are bad movies.
No, I agree with you completely.
But to see, hey, once it went out to the cinema going crowd and was digested and kind of gained a cultural conscience, how was it received? And this is both a question that's kind of we're asking of the director, how well did you do it? But also to the audience, how well did you get it?
Yeah, exactly. I love that. And that's what made it so much fun to watch all these films. But yeah, Full Metal Jacket, what a wild ride. Do you have any final thoughts on this one before we move on?
I do have one quick final thought, which was you made a mention about how they're on a bit of a budget when they made this.
Right.
And I thought that really lined up when I was rewatching this, and there's the final scene when they kill the sniper.
Yeah.
If you look at the set there, it kind of looks like a Universal Studios ride. Like,
yes, I thought the
you can tell
same
the flame
thing.
is kind of fake, and you can just really tell, like, that's a soundstage in Burbank.
Literally, I'm so glad you pointed that out because that was what was so funny. I watched the order that we are discussing these movies is backwards from the order I watched it in, essentially.
Which is crazy.
Which is kind of silly of me. But you know, it gave me a interesting perspective of it. But so that was just so funny because comparing, the set design and production design of Full Metal Jacket and then Hurt Locker, it's like it is worlds apart. Like it's actually just there's literally like in that scene you were talking about, there's literally just like crumpled scraps of paper on the ground. Like, you know, they're just trying to make it look messy and grimy and destroyed. But I think, they were working with what they had. And
and they did well.
And it still works. It still works. I mean, I will say the thing that I loved about that scene was maybe the production design, they didn't have the budget to go above and beyond, but the camera work they used for that scene made it feel so real for even though it's like obviously clearly pretty old and stuff. So at this point in time, but yeah, so I was rocking with like the score in that scene. It's so ominous and like and unsettling. It's like the most intense part of the film, honestly, besides maybe like the really crazy "This is my rifle" bathroom scene at the beginning, which scared the shit out. Oh my god, I did not see that coming. And like
the smile as well.
Oh, what a brilliant performance. Oh my god. Like I guess like in a way I saw it coming, but I also was like, I hope it doesn't get to this point.
And they totally make you think it's not, because once he gets on the rifle range, he's very proficient.
Yeah, he's good to go.
He starts succeeding, and I believe they're like 8 hours from being done from basic. So you're not expecting it. Now, granted, I was not even an idea 20 years before this movie came out, or after this movie came out. So, I had that spoiled to me long before I ever saw the movie, but it's still, even though you know what's going to happen, still incredibly tense.
Oh, it's so intense. It's so jarring and just like, oh, it's so heartbreaking too, because just seeing his transition from like the beginning to that, it's just like, it's the thing that I think is so heartbreaking about it is that it's not surprising. You know what I mean? Like, you're just like, of course, this dude literally snapped. Yeah. Like, he's just been abused in every sense of the word for the past few months. Like, I don't know how many of these people even survived that. Like, that is just a horrible traumatic experience. And, oh, yeah, that performance was just bone chilling, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Had to shout that out. Yeah, really scary scene, but really well done at the same time.
And then parodied a million times after.
Yeah, that was something, I mean, that's what was so funny watching this. This was my first time watching this movie, and like, I was surprised how much I hadn't had spoiled, to be honest. Like, I was like, oh my god, I'm very blessed in a way to have missed all these spoilers and kind of get to see this with fresh eyes. But at the same time, as certain things would happen, I'd be like, oh, that's where that's from.
Yeah. Oh, that's that. Yeah.
That's that Family Guy episode.
Are you thinking of the bars of soap? But in the into the socks? Yeah, that stood out to me the first time I saw that scene, because I was like, oh, that's the Family Guy bit where they put the money in because it's the prep school kids, so they put the money in the socks.
Yes, exactly.
I did not know that was from there when I first saw that.
No, never would have put that together. So it is amazing to see how culturally relevant this film is all these years later. It's pretty cool. And I think if anything, it'll just be more and more interesting to look back on as the years go on.
I definitely, especially as the conversation about Vietnam becomes much more nuanced and much more frank about kind of our role in Vietnam and how that war played out. Because I think as the generation that fought in Vietnam is in their twilight years currently, and over the next 2 decades or so will, start exiting the cultural conversation. I think we're going to be much more willing to have critical conversations about the Vietnam War and about what happened. Now, not to say we haven't spent 60 years talking about it and being like, holy shit, our bad.
No, of course. It's always been relevant.
I still think we're going to really unpack that over the next 2 decades. And I think there's going to be a lot more criticism to be had.
I think so too. Cause like when it's like, there's still a level of sensitivity and respect that has to be maintained just because these people went through that stuff and it was crazy and it was deeply traumatic. And, so yeah, I completely agree with you. I think it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out over time. And maybe we'll see more of that in the movies. Obviously, we've got The Sympathizer, so maybe it's just the beginning. We'll have to see. Any final thoughts before we move on? Good to go?
One note I had was just in the jelly donut scene. I guess I was hungry when I put this note down because I was like, dude, I would kill for a jelly donut right now.
Dude, that scene was brutal.
But yeah, I guess to leave it off, my last note about the movie was the movie does in fact acknowledge that America has an appetite for war, both on screen and I think to a more visceral in action sort of way.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. I mean, this is an iconic movie. It really is. So, and there's a reason for that. Definitely check it out, listeners. We want to hear what you guys think of Full Metal Jacket. We want to hear if you agree or disagree with our takes. Is this an anti-war movie? Is it not? Let us know. You guys can watch the film right now on Amazon Prime. So check it out and send us your thoughts. Alrighty, Matt is going to introduce our second film of the day, which I'm very excited to talk about. Take it away, Matt.
Alrighty. Our second film of the day is my favorite of the 3, released in 2005. It is Jarhead, directed by British director Sam Mendes. It stars Jake Gyllenhaal, Jamie Foxx, and Peter Sarsgaard. It takes place beginning in the late 1980s and follows the story of Anthony Swafford, a Marine who becomes a scout sniper in Operation Desert Storm in 1991, which was the American invasion of Iraq after their invasion of Kuwait. It is based off of a real-life book written by Anthony Swafford.
I couldn't believe that. I didn't know that until researching the film after watching. So that was really crazy to hear, and definitely made it interesting researching like the response to this film, because there's a lot of controversy around this movie.
Yes, there is. Which I did not know. It released to some pretty mixed critical acclaim. It also has accusations of plagiarism.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yes. But I will say the movie pretty quickly responded to those with, this is a pretty basic telling of a Marine's experience. Now, I don't remember who wrote the book that was accusing of plagiarism, but basically they said like, hey, you wrote a book about a Marine's experience in war. This is a book about a Marine's experience in war.
Fair enough.
I don't know if you know this. There's going to be some similarities. And I guess I would have to do more research on exactly what was like accused of being stolen.
No, I think I may have saw something similar to that, but I think, that's a fair point. Like, I don't know exactly how well this followed the memoir. I haven't read it, of Anthony Swafford, but it does seem very much like a movie adaptation. Like, I would imagine it doesn't follow it word for word. From beginning to end.
I doubt it does either. I think the movie also, because from what I can tell, from what I know about the book, which I have not read, and interviews done with Anthony Swafford, he does seem to be, and I guess the movie does touch on this a little bit, but he does seem to be much more reflective and introspective than the movie makes him out to be. Whereas the movie kind of pitches, he's a jarhead.
Yeah,
he's an empty receptacle.
He very much is a jarhead in this.
Yeah. He's meant to be filled with the ideas that the Marines espouse, but he is not, in fact, as critical. Whereas I think, I think he was 18 when he joined, maybe 19.
I think, somewhere around there. I think he was like 20, maybe.
It might have been 20. But either way,
he's on his way to college.
There's the great line, got lost on my way to college.
What the fuck are you even doing here?
Sir, I got lost on the way to college, sir!
Really, really great opening to this movie.
Yes, totally agree.
Where, it's clear he's not going with a direction in life, and the Marines give him that purpose. And I think that's something that we'll definitely discuss a little bit later. But I think that's a really, really important theme in all of these movies.
Yes, totally agree.
And I think that theme, though important to the movies, has also been why a lot of these movies are misconstrued in their purpose. And I will admit, we're critiquing these movies. We're looking at it under this lens. But the reason I wanted to do that is I saw this movie maybe 15 times throughout college.
Oh my God.
And
I don't know why that's so funny to me.
Well, it's like, I remember like a few times I've watched this movie, like it would be the same exact layout of I'd be watching with one other person.
Yep.
We'd have a few beers in us.
Yep.
Just to get over to the threshold that's like, that's kind of fucking sick. Like, yeah, I want to join the Marines. So like, I totally admit, I'm also part of the audience that doesn't get these movies. Like the reason I wanted to do this is because I think what this movie is criticizing somehow still hits that inherent nature of like, hey, are you a little lost and confused what you're doing with your life, young man?
Right.
Here, we'll figure it out for you. Totally outsource purpose to a higher power. And I think, there's a lot of conversation about young men in the past 10 years just kind of being a little listless. And I think, generally I feel I have a purpose in life and whatnot, but I think, even that, it still speaks to me, even though the movie's thesis is, hey, just because you don't really know what you want to do with your life does not mean the Marines have the answer just because they're really good at telling you they do have the answer.
Exactly. Like the first line, one of the first lines in the movie is, and I started to think maybe joining the Marine Corps wasn't such a good idea. It's almost comic.
Exactly.
It's like funny, honestly, because you're just like, from an outside perspective, you're seeing all this boot camp, crazy, brutal shit that they're going through, and you're like, dude, of course. Like, did you not know what you were signing up for? And I think that's a really important aspect here, too, where it's like, a lot of these guys didn't know what they were signing up for. And that's maybe not okay, honestly. Like, that's unfortunate.
Well, yeah, after Vietnam, we could not, like, the American people would not stand for a draft anymore. Like, granted, I'm in the selective service. Every man age 18 to 30, maybe 28, maybe 35. I think 35 actually.
Yeah, I think you're right.
In the selective service. It would be so politically unpopular. There's almost no way, unless there was a major existential threat to America, that our armed forces would be made up of a draft population.
Right.
So in the 80s, in the 90s, and you really see this in the 2000s, there's this huge wave of, all right, we got to recruit. So the 80s has all these, which are objectively great Army commercials that are, they're not true. It's not what your experience in the Army is going to look like, but they look fun.
Yeah.
And recruiters go to high schools. They pitch. I graduated high school in 2019, and in 2017, a Marine recruiter went to my high school.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I remember, what they do is, they set up the pull-up bar and they just kind of challenge people to see how many pull-ups they can get.
And who's not going to do that?
Yeah, exactly. Me, frankly, I was not doing pull-ups in high school. Fuck, I'm not doing pull-ups now. But there's this push in America to naturally get people to join the armed services. And in the 80s, a lot of that is there is some great promotion for the armed services. One of the biggest, I think the biggest day or period of time for naval registration since World War II, I believe, was after Top Gun was released.
Oh, wow.
Don't quote me on that.
That's
I know it was a huge uptick.
Yeah.
I can't remember if that is an entirely true fact. But so, yeah, the 80s, the Reagan era, they were really pouring a lot of money into this idea that's like, hey, come on, join the Army.
Totally.
Fun.
Yeah.
And, that resonates with a lot of 18-year-olds that are they don't really know what direction they're going into. College might not be on the cards.
Yeah, because also, like, what 18-year-old does know what they want to do?
No, exactly.
Like it's a very easy target group, to be honest. It seems like a very successful rate.
Getting 18-year-olds to do something, famously not one of the more difficult things to do.
Yeah, exactly.
And, they're not really thinking too long term. So, yeah, I think Swofford really demonstrates this in the movie where you didn't fucking know.
Yeah. I think
join the Marines.
I think a huge part of it, too, is like, their parents served in Vietnam. And that was a big thing for Swofford as well, is like he came from a military family. So it was almost like, do I go to college or do I just do what everyone in my family has done? Like, that seems like an obvious choice. Everyone's done it. Obviously, I can do it too. And so I think that's also like a really interesting aspect of joining the army and stuff is specific to Jarhead, like hearing all the different characters. They kind of do dive into like all their reasons for being there, and they're all pretty different, which is really interesting as well, compared to like obviously Full Metal Jacket. Everyone just showed up because they had to, whereas like you see there still are instances where people didn't have any other option but to join the army or the Marines in Jarhead. But that's what makes Swofford's character so interesting, is that that line, "I got lost on the way to college, sir," it kind of gives you this like idea of like, oh, you know what, maybe he was not going to do this for a second.
Yeah I think it's a really good distinction where with Full Metal Jacket they didn't have a choice.
Exactly. Yeah.
Whereas Swofford doesn't have options. He doesn't have like commitments. He doesn't have to go to any of these places. So why not the Marines?
Yes.
And granted, 1989, probably, you're not thinking you're going to war. The Soviet Union is pretty openly collapsing at that point. I believe Poland is already having free elections. The wall is down. So America's great existential threat is already going the way of the dodo. So, he hits a point where he's probably like, that is a consistent paycheck. It's a reason to do something. There's definitely something to that joining the Marines in 89 probably did sound like a pretty good deal.
Yeah, honestly. I totally agree. Yeah, I totally agree with your points. And oh my God, I have to say, I love Jake Gyllenhaal. I think he is such a fantastic actor. I loved him in this role. I really loved this movie. I can't lie. I loved the cast. Like Jamie Foxx. The cast
is phenomenal.
Jamie Foxx fucking killed it.
Yeah. I would follow Jamie Foxx in a battle. That movie secured it for me. I was like, oh my God, yeah.
Yeah, I thought his character was really interesting as well, because one thing that I kind of noticed, and I don't know if the way I interpreted it is the way it was meant to be interpreted, but there's a specific scene kind of right at the beginning in the boot camp era of this film, and it's when they're all doing the army crawl and they're shooting bullets like right over their head, and that one kid, he gets so scared that he stands up and he ends up getting shot and killed, and it's such a like horrific moment that Sergeant Sykes, Jamie Foxx character, he literally starts going shit, and he almost kind of like falters from like the hard drill sergeant there for a moment.
Yeah, he totally breaks in that moment.
He like shows like this flare of humanity that is so unexpected. And then seconds later, he's screaming at this dead body, "I told you not to stand up. You still be alive, motherfucker." And,
I think his exact words are, "You'd still be alive if you would listen to me." So he's not talking to the body. He is talking to everyone around, saying like, "Hey, you listen to me, you survive. You don't, you die.
This is what happens." Yeah.
And there's only 2 points of humanity he really has throughout the entire movie, and that is that scene and then the scene outside the burning oil rig.
Yes.
Where he's like, yeah, I'm a professional soldier. This is what I have to do. This is what my life is, and I'm okay with that.
He says he loves the job, too.
Yeah, he loves the job. He says, it's this or my brother's lawn care business in Compton, and I choose this.
Yeah.
And that's paralleled then again when you see he's in Iraq in 2004.
Yes. Yeah. I thought that was really cool that they showed that at the end of just like the consistency of his character. And yeah, so I thought he was a fascinating character in this film. Another one that I loved was, I'm getting their names mixed up, so you may have to help me out here. Whoever played Kruger, I think is who it was. And was he also the one who was talking about how it was either go to jail or join the Marines? Or is that a different character?
I think Kruger was not jail. Now, I could be wrong. I believe that is Fowler.
Oh, yes, that was Fowler. Yes.
Fowler is, the comedic relief. I have a list of quotes that I just thought were hilarious Fowler quotes.
Drop them in the chat.
Okay, so one of them is said to him, which is go pull the legs off a spider, which
yes.
I just thought that was hilarious. There's another in the shower, and I have been ripping this this line forever because it's so funny, where he just goes, "Hey, look, it's a cock, but smaller." For some reason, that's just the funniest line ever.
Yeah, he is also really interesting in that he does play the comedic relief, but then he also has one of the most disturbing complete loss of humanity scenes.
Yes.
When they find him with the burnt body of an Iraqi somewhere in the middle of the desert, and he's like desecrating it. Like he's just like playing with it's like pulling the legs off a spider, honestly. Like it kind of comes full circle there where you're just like, he's completely dehumanized this person who's died in the most horrific way. And then like they also make a really interesting point there where they're like, we don't do things like that in the Marines, save that for the Army or something like that. Like they almost do like a little jab at the Army there. And that was definitely a point where I was like, okay, this movie is half-assing the anti-war theme a little bit. Like, like they're like, oh yeah, we just added that in, but that's it. And so that was a big point for me in this film with like our theme, if you will.
Well, I really like the Fowler character, played by Evan Jones.
Yes.
Because he's playing just one of those psychos really good.
Really well, yeah.
A lot of war movies do this, where when they want to acknowledge, hey, war's bad and pretty fucked up shit happens, they add a psycho character in and just be like, yeah, everyone knows that one psycho. They're just like that. And I've always been a little bit like, yeah, it's a little lazy. Just like, oh, well, there's just one guy that's like that. But come on.
Yeah.
And I've always thought that was a little lazy. But I thought the way he kind of showed it and the way he depicted it was really, really powerful.
I totally agree with you. And I would even add that, like, this movie did kind of set itself apart in that usually, like you're saying, we see so many films like this that have the one, like, trigger-happy kind of crazy character.
Yeah.
But what I thought was really cool about Jarhead is that we meet all these very different characters, all within the same squad, but then we get to see all of them have a complete breakdown, each in their own individual way. You know, Fowler's breakdown is that scene where he's just completely lost it almost, and he's just being such an evil human being, if we're being honest, in that one scene.
Yeah.
And like then we have, Swafford with "This is my rifle," a callback to
that scene's insane.
Oh my god!
So
See, that scene was what had me so shook watching Full Metal Jacket after Jarhead. Is like, I didn't. As soon as they say those lines in Full Metal Jacket, I got chills because that scene in Jarhead was so scary and intense, and so it was really interesting to watch those like backwards. Because obviously, if you've seen Full Metal Jacket and then you watch Jarhead, you're like, oh my god, he's going to kill this guy. Like, and you don't know that he's going to survive it. So that was such a crazy scene. And of course, Jake Gyllenhaal absolutely killed it. That man is amazing at losing his shit on camera. But yeah, so I thought that was crazy. Yeah, he was cooking for sure. But yeah, that was a great breakdown. And then the biggest breakdown for me that was just like made my stomach turn was Troy's at the end when he literally, like, you realize that these people have been transformed, not even to just killer machines, but like killer babies. Like, he throws this like infantile tantrum when he's denied his right to shoot and kill. And it is just like such a disturbing scene of like to see this grown man like literally tantrum, like having a full on baby tantrum. It's over not being able to kill someone. Like it is just so it's fucked up beyond comprehension.
He does have a very good line in there though that does, I think, it contextualizes that breakdown, which a lot of movies have breakdowns and you're like, that person's having a breakdown. And some movies with really good performances have a breakdown where you're like, that's gross. Like, I don't want to see a person like that. And that's one of those where you're like, dude, get a fucking hold of yourself. Jake Gyllenhaal has that face. The general, who I'm blanking on the name of, played by the Allstate guy, who always kills it when he shows up in authoritative roles. But anyways, he has this look on his face where he's seeing this freak out and he's like, another one snapped. He's seeing it where he's like, this thing happened. Because Troy is freaking out. Why am I in the desert? If I can't kill this guy, why the fuck? What have I been doing?
Yeah, especially after training for months to do that and never having that chance.
And I will say, my note for that scene is when I'm sitting there, it's a really well done scene before they come in. I still always think he's going to get the shot off. I always assume it's going to happen. I've seen this movie probably 20 times, and I'm always like, this is actually Sam Mendes released this for me and me alone to see him get the kill. And it's because the kill valorizes why they're there. If they get the kill, that's actually, that's a pretty okay, like, in war, killing a high commanding officer and no one else gets hurt.
Mm-hmm.
That's just bare bones. Like, you can pretty easily rationalize that in war over anything else. It valorizes the sacrifice because this whole movie is about how war generally, especially the way America wages war, is not, it's not this fervent, like, fighting. It's not all action. It's not a scramble. It's a long wait. And they're just in the desert. They make the point of, they throw grenades into nothing. They shoot at nothing. They navigate invisible landmine fields. And so this whole scene kind of culminates as like, hey, at least the whole reason, because this movie's still very entertaining, but it does feel boring. Like, you're entertained, but you feel bored in the desert because you keep going like, when's something going to happen? When's something going to happen? And nothing actually ever happens. The only thing in this movie that's like, that's action is when the Warthog scene takes out the Humvee, when those planes come in and blow up the Humvee, and the burning of the oil field. Which they make which is a very important distinction because that's kind of what the average American soldier's view of war is in a lot of cases is, we do all the damage with planes now. Like, all the war happens with the plane, and then, and I guess the mortar scene. And that's the only action that the soldiers are faced with. Jake Gyllenhaal pisses himself. It's the only time he's in action. And so I think we're all sitting there going like, valorize Troy's sacrifice to get out here. He knows he's going home. He knows he's out of there. And they take that away because they're like, you want to see some fucking fireworks? Yeah, we're going to blow up the whole airfield.
Yeah, they're like, this is awesome. And he's like,
okay, no. I could have stayed in Virginia if this was the case.
100%. Yeah, I totally agree with your point. I think that's something that really sets this movie apart for me is just like the fact that there's no action in a war movie. And really, I loved how it really focused on, I think it's fascinating to think that the boredom and like mundane day-to-day life that is also just like honestly emotionally destructive and mentally destructive, like specifically the unfaithful wives and girlfriend kind of thing. That was crazy to me how much of a role that played in everything and in Swafford's just mental deterioration, honestly. Like it just, and so many of them too. It's not just him, it's all of them. Like that's what's like, and that's what's so messed up about it is like at first they're people waiting for them, that like loyalty and the wait for them is like their morale. And the second they lose that, which I think like it seems the culture of the military life wants that to happen because once they've lost that, it's clipped. Like once they've lost that, then they succumb to the boredom and like the insanity, and killing becomes their morale when like their loved ones betray them. Like shooting their rifle ultimately becomes what they look forward to. And of course, it makes sense because it's all they've been trained for, and the training is physically, emotionally, and psychologically abusive. So at least what we see in this film. So that was like such an interesting aspect to me.
Like the Jody comment that is used throughout this movie, that's a very real thing. The military does use that. That's commonly said, and like drill instructors say that. Like the Jody line has been used since the 40s. That's a pretty common. Like in World War II, they were saying it, and the idea behind it. Now, you know, you're not going to find this on like any military website or something. Is generally you're a worse soldier in combat if what you're thinking about is your loved one at home. You're a better soldier in combat if you're like, the thing I'm here to do is the objective, not the thing I'm here to do is to do the objective and get home to my wife or girlfriend.
Yeah.
The objective is to kill, and maybe I get killed doing it.
Yeah, the objective is more important than survival at this point. Exactly.
And I think this movie shows how that breaks down and how different people come to terms with it. And I think Jamie Foxx's character clearly comes to terms with it in, I don't want to say the best way, but like the least messy way, where he's like, yeah, I don't have things at home.
Yeah.
My job is out here. Who I am is out here. My job is the objective. I'm going to do the objective. And the things at home would keep me from that.
Yes, exactly. In a way, in a very twisted way, he seems to have the most healthy psychological detachment.
He has the healthiest relationship with it.
Yeah, exactly. Because he's much more self-aware and has so much more experience than these other kids. Like they're literally kids. So, you know, he's a sergeant. Like he's running that shit as well. Like he's worked his way up the ranks. He's seen everything, and he's older than them. Like there's just so many factors that set him apart from the other characters. I was shocked how much of a big role the unfaithfulness played in this film, but by the end I was like, oh, because for a second I was like, okay, like if this doesn't come full circle, this is just kind of like disgusting and weird. To be honest, like the deer hunter scene, I was like, oh my lord, what are we doing here?
Oh my god, I always forget about the deer hunter scene until it comes on, and I'm like, oh right,
it's horrible. It's shocking. Oh my god,
that one's a lot more jarring than Jake Gyllenhaal's like, he's realizing his girlfriend has moved on.
Yeah.
Whereas that one's just like, whoa, what the fuck?
Yeah. Well, and what's, I think the cherry on top of like the disturbingness of that is Jake Gyllenhaal's reaction.
Yes.
Like, and to that, I forget who he's talking to, but I think it's like his
He's
buddy.
talking to Troy.
Yeah. And Troy's just like, no, dude, like,
no, you can't fucking do that.
We're not doing this. Like, you're actually, and oh man, Jake Gyllenhaal's performance is so great in that scene because he's trying so hard to like be like hard and like keep his composure and just be like, yeah, I just want to watch this porn. And then all of a sudden those tears start welling and you're just like, oh, dude, you're broken. Oh, it's heartbreaking.
Also coming right off of, or maybe right before, one of the more jarring, just something in the way pops up in the movie, which I was like, whoa, hey, this song.
Yeah, no, I know. I was like, it's hilarious how much this is associated with like the Batman now.
Yeah.
Great soundtrack.
Which to any listeners who have not seen the Batman, it is re-releasing in theaters later this month.
No way.
With a sneak preview of the Penguin.
Oh, let's go.
I don't work for Warner Brothers. I did that for free.
Yes. Oh man, well we'll definitely have to do a group outing to that. That would be awesome.
Trey and I have already.
Oh hell yeah!
We're figuring it out right now.
Oh,
it's only AMC theaters from what I've been able to ascertain.
Okay.
Which I'm okay. I like AMC.
It's nice. It's
Heartbreak feels good.
Very
in a place
fancy
like this.
in there. Yeah. No. Go ahead.
To jump back on the Jamie Foxx seems to have the healthiest relationship with war.
Yeah.
There is an argument that the character played by Lucas Kruger, Black, by the way, from Fast and Furious 3, Tokyo Drift fame.
I did not put that together, but
yes, that's it.
I was like, where have I seen this fucker? It was pissing me off. That makes so much sense.
He has a very healthy relationship where he understands that it is completely bastardized. He's like, yeah, we are here because America buys a lot of oil from Kuwait. Like, we are here to secure a bottom line, and we bring stability to the region because that generally benefits shareholder value. Now, the reason I think his character is in there and also, is critical and seems to have a healthy enough disdain for the war, but it's like, yeah, this is a stepping stone in my life. Because I think he makes a comment about, he's like, yeah, I didn't have anywhere to go, but I can go places after the Marines.
Exactly. Gives him options.
It gives him options. He's got a pretty like cynical, I'm here for the check kind of thing, which is important because he's shown as the most successful at the end of the movie as he's leading a pitch in a boardroom. Now, here's a tidbit that I give anytime I watch this movie with someone. The movie is released in 2005, which is very important. So he's in a room in some real estate company in Texas in 2005, and the graphs behind him, one graph says houses sold, and it's just a projection until 2010, and they're all going up.
No.
And then below is average cost of house, and it's also just the same, it's like a
going straight up,
skyrocketing, which is a hilarious, because this is before, that's not a comment about the housing crisis. They just accidentally, you look back at that and go like, all right, 2008 is right down the pipeline.
Literally predicted the future in Jarhead.
So every time I see that scene, like, I always pause it because it's at the very end, so it's not rude, but I'm always like, oh. The 2008 market crash is about to happen.
It's like that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood scene. He's like,
yep. No, that is exactly me every time I see that scene. I also think his character is a little bit shoehorned in there for American audiences in 2005.
Yeah.
Because in 1991, we did not have a problem going into the Gulf War, really. There were people that were against it. But frankly, it was a very fast war. We won it better than almost any military victory has ever happened in history. Like, we won that war so fast. And the movie makes a comment of it where, like, all the soldiers are like, hey, I thought we were going to fight. And they were like, oh, we won really quickly.
Yeah. No, totally.
But in 2005, and there's another quote that really impacts this. I think they're kind of talking to the about to be tired of the Iraq war crowd, because, Iraq was not very popular, but Bush was able to swing it with the anti-9/11 fervor. Granted, Iraq had nothing to do. They didn't have weapons of mass destruction. And the company that ended up getting the leasing rights for drilling the oil, so they couldn't sell the oil, but they got paid to drill it, was the company that the vice president was the former CEO of. So, it's a pretty rough look on paper. Like, clearly the Iraq war was not, we did not need to be there. And we're pretty open about that. Not saying Saddam Hussein was a great guy, but we didn't need to be there. But in 2005, the American audience is already a little bit like, why is this our third?
Why is this still going on? Yeah.
And Fowler has a very interesting line at the end where they're burning everything in the big bonfire. And he runs over and he's got all of his camo in his hands. And he says, get your jungle camis. I'm burning these. We won't, basically saying we won't need the desert camo.
Yeah.
That's only coming on the fact that, still American forces are stationed throughout the Middle East, and that's not changing anytime soon. But by 2005, the American populace was kind of tired of these never-ending wars. And, granted, our last war we got out of was 2 years ago we got out of Afghanistan. So, this movie does make a comment that is like, from the broad perspective, we don't need to be here. And this is what the psychological toll of people being here looks like.
Yeah.
But it still gets muddied up because I think a lot of people still resonate with maybe the answer's not pretty and it's not easy, but the Marines have an answer for what to do with your life.
Quick interruption. Sorry, I wanted to clear this up before moving on to the next part of the episode. As I was editing this, I realized that I kept saying Fowler when I meant to be saying Kruger, so I wanted to clear that up to avoid any confusion. But continue on and enjoy the episode.
No, totally. And oh man, I love talking about Fowler because I do think he was one of my favorite characters in this, and that like he was calling shit out and it was very unexpected. Like, you know, even one of the scenes that stood out to me the most was the interviews, and there's like a discussion about free speech right before it, and it's such a crazy scene because he asks, he's like, or Sergeant Sykes, Jamie Foxx's character, is like, here's what you can say to the press. And he goes, whoa, what the fuck? What about free speech? And he goes, nope, you signed a contract, you have no rights. And it's like,
yeah, I think he said property of the U.S. government.
Yeah, he's like, nope, that's not how this is gonna go. And
that's why Kruger doesn't say anything in that interview.
Kruger doesn't say shit, and it's such a great scene. And even like the question they ask him, I thought was really interesting because it's very like of what you were talking about, like the kind of honestly the straight up just like racist 9/11 fervor going on. They're like, oh, how do you feel about the Iraqis? Do you have nightmares about them? Like such a targeted question. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a clear message they're trying to say behind that. And he just sits there and he's like, I'm not saying shit. And even like right after that, you know, that's when I feel like he really starts to open up and to the group and like talks more about just like the politics around it. And there's that one crazy scene where he says, who do you think gave Saddam all those weapons? We did. And I think Troy says, fuck politics, we're here, all the rest is bullshit. And I thought that was a really powerful that was a good like anti-war message of this film, of just like these two are in the same troop, they're in the same squad, they're doing the same mission, and yet they're like completely divided on like their perspective of what they're there to do. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, Fowler was definitely a very fascinating and I think necessary character. And in a way, like he may have just been there for the anti-war messaging a little bit because it doesn't go that much deeper into it besides the obvious like psychological damage and dehumanization aspects of this. But I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think this is a similarity with Full Metal Jacket, where once again, a lot of the anti-war message rests on what are we doing to our American boys that fight these wars.
Yep.
It's not, it doesn't argue that we shouldn't be doing these wars.
Yeah.
This one, Full Metal Jacket kind of dances around it, and this one somewhat dances around it.
Yep.
But both movies kind of pitch like, hey, if we could figure out a way to have no Americans on the ground, we'd be fine with these wars. If like we could have robots do it, which in the past 10 years we've been able to do for the most part, kind of pitches like, hey, we don't want the American human cost of war, but we don't mind the human cost of war.
And that's where it completely undermines itself for me.
Yes.
I just don't. Yes. I'm like, I can't agree with that. It's not anti-war, man. It's not. It's making it personal. Not what it's about. So, yeah, I think that's a really good point as well. Final thoughts on Jarhead before we move on. I guess I want to talk about just like, we've talked about performances. Performances were off the charts in this film. But I also loved, I didn't even realize until after watching it that this is Roger Deakins' cinematography. And that makes so much sense because the visual,
especially the oil fields.
This movie was shockingly beautiful to me just because I guess like, I don't know, judgmental of me, but I was not expecting a war film to be so like visually stunning. I thought it would focus on more other elements. So seeing that was so fucking cool. I loved like the color palette of this film so much. It's very like, it fits the like dull, mundane, but like borderline kind of losing your shit. And then also just like the juxtaposition of like, or like not the contrast of like the sand, like it almost looks white. And then their army green almost looks black. Like it was just such a cool visual aesthetic that I just had me locked in from beginning to end. I can't lie.
It is one of those movies where you really feel the uncomfortableness of the terrain it's filmed in.
Oh,
Like,
the
I was
heat.
breaking a sweat while watching. The heat looks
scorching.
killer.
Yes.
At night, it looks freezing. Like, they do
Yeah.
a really good job setting up, like, hey, this is boring as shit and uncomfortable.
Yeah. Like, those are two things. If I'm uncomfortable, I start to literally lose my mind. So I know for a fact I would not survive in this setting, especially in heat. Oh my God, the sun takes me out on another level. So, like that scene when they're playing the football in their gas gear or some shit like
God.
that. I was like, I would literally puke. Like, even just watching it, I was getting nauseous. I was like, I can't even fathom the sweltering, like, heat just all stuck inside this one suit. Oh, it was making me claustrophobic, honestly.
When I do see that scene, though, and this kind of harkens back to, as much as I'm criticizing how a lot of people react to this movie and how I am also sometimes totally what I'm criticizing, when I see that scene, I'm kind of like, that looks fun. That looks so uncomfortable, but that looks fun.
That's what was so interesting about it, is like, that's why I also wanted to bring it up in terms of like our theme today, is like, they are told to play football in their suits as punishment. And yet that scene, they're like, woohoo! Like, they're having a good ass time. And it kind of like throws you off from like, okay, what are we really doing here? This does feel very cinematic. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I think it's something to do, and that's the big thing. It is, they have something suddenly. And
so true.
I mean, there's a part in Gyllenhaal's narration where he's saying, like, when a Marine is dealing with boredom, here are the Marine Corps' remedies: jerk off, read letters from loved ones, jerk off again, clean your rifle. And so the movie does a really good job of telling you, like, hey, they're trying to find shit to do. And so even in the rain scene, when they're getting punished and they're stacking up all the sandbags, they don't look as distressed. Like, yeah, it's heavy and it's pouring rain on them. They don't look as disheveled and distressed as when they're just hanging out and there's nothing happening.
Yeah, because in those moments when they're hanging out, that's really the moments when they're hanging out is mostly talk around the unfaithful wife girlfriend thing. And so they're when they're like, when they don't have a mission, that's when they're spiraling, because they're just like, oh my God, what is happening elsewhere? That's when they start to like disassociate from where they really are and who they are. And
there's a big point that, like, a lot of people that return from service do say, which is their life kind of goes on pause, but no one else's back home goes on pause. And so they return to a much different social dynamic that they may have left. It's not uncommon that significant others leave them after a certain period of time. Their families also, in a lot of cases, just learn to live without them. And unlike when a lot of young people go out and they maybe move to a new city or they leave, they establish roots in that new city. But the whole thing about the armed services is you're kind of supposed to be able to get up and go. So you never have those roots anywhere.
So true. Yes.
And so a lot of people just feel like they go, all right, say you're joining because you want the GI Bill to pay your college at 18. You sign up for 6 years at 24. You return home. Everyone has moved past the stage of life that you were in when you left. But to an extent, when you come home, you kind of expect everyone to be there waiting for you, and that's not the case. And a lot of veterans really do have a problem, or like have a problem adjusting to that. And especially they see their families have created routines that don't involve them.
Oh, it's so heartbreaking, because you can 100% understand both sides, where it's like each side is just surviving in their own way without the other. And yet by doing that, it kind of harms that person. So it's like, oh, it's just gut wrenching, honestly, especially the way they depict it in this. But yeah, man, there's so much to unpack in this film. I loved Jarhead. I loved the visual aesthetic. Obviously, I can't stop talking about it. I'm a huge fan of film score, and Thomas Newman is one of my all-time favorites. I thought his score for this was fantastic, so I had to shout that out. But Yeah, this is definitely a movie worth watching. I think one, it's really enjoyable, even though it's like horrible. It feels weird to say that it's an enjoyable movie, but it is just like you're so locked in from beginning to end.
All the parts are really good.
They're all really
every
good
component
together.
going into the movie, and so even if the subject matter you're not supposed to be enjoying,
Right.
which granted, once again, I'll admit I do find myself enjoying the subject matter.
Yeah.
It's just such a well done movie. I was shocked that I learned it didn't come out to great critical acclaim.
No, so true. And like there was a lot of controversy around like people being two sides. There were people saying, wow, this is one of the most realistic depictions of life in the Marines that I've ever seen. And the other side of that was, oh my God, this paints Marines in such a horrible negative light.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, which is it? Like, why can't it be both, to be honest? And so I thought that was really fascinating to look at. And then just even, yeah, like honestly, 2005, like the historical context around this film is important to think of as well. So I'm glad we touched on that. And I highly recommend Jarhead out of all these films. It's a great one. Don't miss it. Any final thoughts before we move on?
No, you know what? I think we checked every box I had. The only other line I'm just gonna point to, because it's just a great line, is when they're talking about when they're learning to snipe, and they're talking about like what you're looking for. Jamie Foxx describes the perfect shot as the Kennedy shot. And says they're going for the pink mist. I remember I watched that with a few buddies of mine, and we all thought that was a pretty funny line.
I love it. Yeah, the pink mist. It's a big full circle thing in this film for sure. So definitely check it out. You guys can stream Jarhead. You can rent it right now on Amazon Prime along with Full Metal Jacket. Let us know what you guys think. We're going to take a quick break now, and during that break, you guys will hear from the incredible Sonia Maru for Sonia's Movie Minute.
Sonia!
Hello, I'm Sonia, and this is my Movie Minute. I just finished reading Naomi Klein's incredible book, The Shock Doctrine. In it, Klein chronicles what she calls the rise of disaster capitalism. Her discussion of Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib made me revisit several films that deal with the subject of post-9/11 detainees and the torture inflicted in detention centers. Each film deals with about the same time period, the years immediately after 9/11, and then the lasting effects of shock and torture. In the report from 2019, Adam Driver plays a real Senate staffer who led the effort to write a comprehensive report about the CIA's torture protocols in Iraq. Despite efforts from the highest levels of government to thwart his investigation, he's able to write a 6,700-page report which exposes horrific truth. The Mauritanian from 2021 is a more personal story which focuses on the experience of one man, Mohamedou Ould Slahi, a man who's abducted from his home in Mauritania, imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay, and subjected to torture and wrongful imprisonment for over a decade. In The Card Counter, also from 2021, Oscar Isaac plays a professional gambler and former military interrogator who is deeply disturbed by the things he did when stationed at Abu Ghraib. All three of these films came out in the COVID era when a lot of movies were being overlooked because they didn't have proper releases. And I think that all three are absolutely worth a watch or a revisit. All three of these films came out in the COVID era when a lot of movies were being overlooked since they didn't have proper releases, and I think all three are absolutely worth a watch or a revisit. Together, they paint a rich, tragic, and disgusting picture of the United States policies towards both prisoners and enlisted people.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Gimme Three Podcast. Today, we've been talking The War Within, America's love-hate relationship with war, following 3 anti-war movies picked by Matt himself. So far, we've talked about Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, followed by Sam Mendes' Jarhead. And up next, for our third and final film, we have Kathryn Bigelow's 2008 Academy Award Best Picture winner, The Hurt Locker. The Hurt Locker won 6 out of its 9 Academy Award nominations, securing Best Picture, Best Original Screenplay, Sound Editing, Sound Mixing, Film Editing, and Best Director, making Kathryn Bigelow the first woman to win Best Director in Oscar history. Pretty awesome stuff there. The film grossed $49.2 million worldwide, and I learned that when adjusted for inflation, this makes it the lowest grossing Oscar Best Picture ever, which is pretty crazy to think about.
I did not know that.
Isn't that interesting? Like,
because I remember when this movie came out, it was definitely overshadowed by Avatar.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it's Avatar won cinematography over this one, which I thought was pretty crazy.
And I remember the question was, would Avatar win for Best Picture, which was interesting because that is directed by James Cameron, and Kathryn Bigelow and James Cameron famously married for a few years.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. That's so funny. But yeah, the film had quite a small budget of $15 million, similar to Stanley Kubrick's, and was independently produced by Kathryn herself. Kathryn and Mark Bowl wrote the screenplay together based on the events that he witnessed as an embedded journalist in 2004. He went for 2 weeks in Iraq with the U.S. bomb squad, and he would email Bigelow back and forth just all of the things he was seeing, and together they worked on this script. They wanted to create a film that really puts the viewer in the boots of these soldiers, specifically the ones that run towards the source that everyone else is running away from. So today, The Hurt Locker is also considered to be one of the most influential war films of the 2000s. And in 2020, the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress selected it for preservation for its cultural, historical, or aesthetic significance. So I thought that was pretty cool as well. But the film stars Jeremy Renner as William James, a newly appointed bomb squad team leader of a unit, with Anthony Mackie as Sergeant J.T. Sanborn and Brian Garrity as Specialist Owen Eldridge. Renner's character, James, is a fucking wild man, as he's called in the film, or adrenaline junkie in army gear. He rolls the dice of life or death every single day and walks right into deadly situations with no hesitation. While this makes his squad of Sanborn and Eldridge uneasy, there's really no denying that James has a gift for defusing bombs. Alrighty, Matt, what did you think of Bigelow's Hurt Locker? Had you seen this one before?
So I had seen this, I want to say the first time I saw it, maybe I was 14.
Oh,
so
wow.
That would have been 4 years after it came out.
Yeah.
And what I knew going into this movie was a description my dad gave me about it, where he said he saw it in theaters, and he said it gave him the same reaction that the opening scene of Private Ryan gives you, where your knuckles are white, just holding on to the cup holder in the cinema.
Love it.
And I think that's very true. This movie is very tense. This movie is really well done, really, really well written. I will say, and we'll get into this more, I think it has not held up. And I actually, complaints I didn't have before until we went in with this lens, I have, and I think of the 3 movies, I have the most complaints about this one.
Oh, I'm excited.
And so there's definitely a lot to unpack. I'm also a huge Kathryn Bigelow fan. She directed one of my favorite movies, Point Break. So if you ever have a podcast about surfers that rob banks dressed as presidents, please invite me back. But I really, really like this movie. Well, I loved this movie the first few times I watched it. There were some things that really pissed me off.
Yeah.
And we'll get into that as we unpack this movie.
Yeah. No, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I saw this film for the first time in college. It was just a few years ago, honestly, with some friends. And I was just blown away. I was like, this is one of the craziest things I've ever seen, honestly. Like, I was just locked in. My palms were sweating. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know where it was going to go. And I really, really loved it. I think it's really such a visually beautiful film as well. Sorry, I talk about that so much, but I love the stylistic visual aesthetics of movies. And this one really stood out to me. One, we've got like gorgeous 16 millimeter films, which gives it that really pretty, like gritty grain that was just perfect for this film. The cinematography is such a massive aspect of this film for me, especially considering, you know, their goal was to give you kind of like a POV vibe of like, what would it be like if you were there and you were these people doing some of the craziest shit you've ever seen in your life? You know, these people are literally walking towards bombs. Like, that's crazy. And so I thought they did a really great job with the cinematography. Specifically, I loved like the POV shots, which fly through from beginning to end. We've got even like the like drone footage and like shaky handheld camera work, which gives it almost like a pseudo documentary vibe as well, which I thought was super cool. Which in a way is like, I feel like maybe now that I'm thinking about it is kind of a tribute to the co-screenwriter Mark Bald as like, you know, war journalist and his time writing about all these events that he saw and stuff. So I thought that was really cool as well. And then even just one cinematography thing that I thought made a lot of sense for this film and what they were trying to do, but that I also kind of took issue with in terms of like our theme, was these like observer shots of all the local people around.
Yeah.
It feels weird, to say the least. Like, I get that they're trying to convey from these characters' perspectives of like, essentially anyone watching could be the person that's going to set off this bomb as I'm defusing it. But that really brought in that sense of like otherness that I was not rocking with.
So that's kind of where a lot of my issues stem as well.
Yeah.
So this is set in Iraq, which and this is deep into the Iraq War. So this was when U.S. forces were contesting with insurgents much more than they weren't fighting Saddam's army anymore. This is insurgency. This is guerrilla warfare, and improvised explosive devices and car bombs became a very notable aspect of this war. And frankly, it also became a this was the talking point on many major cable news, because this was generally how American soldiers were being killed. There wasn't much that could be done with it. If you drive over an IED and it explodes in a Humvee, you probably just die.
Yeah, and we see that in the film as well. Like, they're like, what are they going to do? What are these tanks going to do? How are they going to stop this?
Exactly. And there's not really any remedy, so it does make death feel like it's just around the corner. But I completely agree. And this was a big conversation during the War on Terror that in my opinion, has not aged very well, which is, we don't know who our enemy is. They don't carry a flag. They look like the general civilian population. How do we contest with them? And a lot of the answers were bad. A lot of the answers just cast a pretty wide net.
Yeah.
And I think this movie kind of valorizes, like, gosh, look how difficult it is to fight in the middle of a civilian population that doesn't want to be there. Gosh, isn't that hard? And you got to ask, there's some more pressing questions to be asked if everyone you're fighting is a regular everyday citizen. And there's a great quote by Jeremy Renner's character. This is after the taxi driver drives up to him and he shoots out the windshield and he puts his handgun to his head. And then the guy finally backs up and drives off, and then he's detained by U.S. forces. They never say if that guy's the bomb maker or anything.
No, they don't say anything.
That guy could be a taxi driver. They don't talk about him at all. But Jeremy Renner has this quote that is, well, if he wasn't an insurgent, he sure is now. And that's a big takeaway from these wars in the Middle East that were long occupational wars, is we got the insurgents, but generally what happens is if you hang out in someone else's country for a really long time, someone's got 3 sons and you kill them, you now have 3 new insurgents, and that's pretty natural. That's just going to happen. You you kill someone's dad, they're gonna try to kill you down the road. And my big concerns was this movie knows that this war is pretty stupid. This movie knows that the way we're waging the Iraq war is not working. The movie knows that it's kind of just a cycle that really only stops after we leave. Now, granted, I believe we left Iraq the year after this movie was released. I think we left it in 2011, and this movie 2 years, because this is 2009.
Yeah.
So now, granted, we didn't entirely leave Iraq, but we, for the most part, left. But the one scene that really pissed me off, because I went on an internet deep dive last night while watching. So there's the scene where they're with the colonel that's also the psychiatrist to the abandoned building. And they're like, yeah, we're just going to dispose of some munitions we found. Mm-hmm. And they find the body of an Iraqi boy that is having an IED, or had an IED buried in him.
Yeah.
That's not a thing that happened. They did not use body bombs. There's one report of a body bomb being used in 2009, and that was a willing and alive person. It wasn't, I'm going to spare the details, but it was placed in the one place that would maybe fit a bomb. Mm-hmm. I'll let viewers figure that one out. But that one was a failed assassination attempt on a Saudi prince. But what they didn't do was bury bombs in chest cavities of children.
Yeah, because that is a shocking scene in the film.
That's also just not, like, I mean, a lot of movies that came out at this time kind of add in, there's always this one scene that I always assume is like a studio added scene that's like, well, we got a lot of people going to these cinemas that can't, or that a studio exec is saying this. I'm not saying this.
Right.
But we got a lot of people going to these movies that still need there to be a clear enemy. And so they make up something that is so obviously horrific and evil.
Yep.
That just these real life insurgents aren't doing. Insurgents don't kill the people of the place they're trying to take over, or the children of the people, and use those as bombs. That doesn't work in an insurgency.
And that ultimately subverts the whole anti-war message of just like,
exactly,
why are we making shit up in a film technically based on real events? Like, something about that just does not feel right.
It does feel, and I think a lot of this podcast has been about how a lot of these movies add something in for the audience, for the American audience's desire.
Yeah.
And they shoehorn in like, oh, but look how some of them are genuinely evil, and sometimes it's not a gray issue. And yeah, I mean, there were horrible things going on in the Middle East during this time. But I think when you make it up, you really lose a lot of ground to stand on.
100%.
Because there were things that they could have done to get the audience completely on the U.S. soldiers' side that did happen. But when you don't use that, it does really diminish your message.
It invalidates it, yeah.
And I think a lot of the movie is leading up to this point where, you know, you're watching Jeremy Renner's character, and the movie opens with the line, "For some, war is a drug." And they're very clear, like, Jeremy Renner's doing this, yeah, because he's good, but, you know, because he's addicted to the adrenaline.
Right.
Multiple characters point that out. Eldritch says, "I don't want to die for his adrenaline rush."
Yep.
She says that at the end of the film. But also Eldritch, also played by the same guy who played O'Donnell in Jarhead. So
I noticed that. That was funny.
Over.
Yeah.
But there's that scene just stuck out to me as like, okay, well, why are we just adding this scene in? And the other scene that is right after that is when the colonel is blown up, because all those civilians come up to him and he's like, no, you guys got to leave. And then someone just leaves a bomb next to him.
Yeah.
Another thing where, like, the Iraqi population, by and large, is not just going about their day-to-day life with IEDs in their pockets.
I did not. That scene was crazy.
A U.S. colonel and be like, oh, this is why I keep my pocket IED. No.
It also was very odd that scene was very odd to me in that, like, I feel like that was the one soldier who interacted with the local people with, like, respect and, like, kindness compared to, you see the way that, like, even, I mean, Jeremy Renner definitely, his character definitely, like, with the kids, he's very, with Beckham, he's, like, kind of takes him under his wing and, like, really cares for him and stuff. But, you know, Mackey's character, he's very aggressive with all of the local people around the area.
Yeah.
And so when you see this guy, like, he's talking about how he loves Iraq. He's like, this is a beautiful place. And, like, I'm so sorry, but you're going to have to move because it's just not safe. And then he gets blown up and you're just like, okay, why did we have to make that?
Yeah, why is there a message that's like, see, this character trusted the Iraqis and he got blown up for it? Stupid fuck. No, it doesn't. Yeah, it really diminishes the message of the movie, in my opinion.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I thought that was very odd, to say the least.
And I do think this movie is very much so from its time. Like,
yeah.
I mean, I was young, but I do remember a lot of the discourse over both the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the big thing being, we don't know who we're fighting. And this is really difficult. But I think when you try to make an anti-war film and then say, but also it's really hard to fight these guys, but we should probably hang out anyways, you kind of diminish the argument. And it's also not hard, because the thing is, if you want to make this movie and valorize Jeremy Renner's character, you can easily do that. By and large, his job is defusing bombs. He is not there, objectively, he should only be shooting at people already shooting at him.
Yeah. He has the most non-violent, non-destructive part in this very deadly war.
And they still, I mean, I don't think they wanted to depict him perfectly, and they didn't. But they do this weird middle route where they're like, the war is bad, the enemy's still worse, don't forget that. But, you know, Jeremy Renner's got some screws loose, and maybe war as a practice isn't the best thing ever. And it's like, all right, well, it kind of feels like you're both sidesing the argument. And I know maybe I'm just not seeing the shades of gray in this, but it did feel like more they painted it in the black brush and a white brush, and they didn't have any shades of gray.
Yeah. I honestly, I think you make a really good point. I think Renner's character is really interesting, William James, because, you know, he's like the crazy cowboy, and like, but then he also has a very compassionate side to him, the way we see him with Beckham, and even the way we see him with Eldridge. He's like, come on, buddy, like, you got it, buddy. He's very like, very much is like protective. But at the same time, it's like you were saying, they're trying to show you that there's like screws loose. And even like at the very end of the film, he has this line where he says to Mackey's character, Sanborn, he's like, do you know why I am the way I am? And he's like, no, I don't. And in that scene, I feel like, you know, he kind of he's also asking him, like, why do you do this, essentially? And he doesn't even have like an answer. He's just like, I don't know. I just do it.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, that was an opportunity to like say something. And
I remember that scene standing out to me last night, because I was like, oh, right. I totally forgot. He explains everything in the scene, and then he doesn't. And I was like, oh, yeah, okay, that makes more sense.
And then cut to, we see him go back home, and he has this crazy scene where he's like, I mean, I think that whole sequence is really interesting in terms of like showing American consumerism and how much like him and his family have, even though like he consents that they are suffering in terms of like not having his presence there. Like they're like, we don't want you to leave, but he sees how much they have and all this stuff. And it makes you think of like, it made me think like, oh, he's thinking of Beckham and all these kids over there who have nothing compared to his own child. And then he's like telling the story of like, to his kid who's like a baby. So he's kind of just self-reflecting essentially. And he's like, you know, as you get older, you find that you only love maybe one or two things. And for me, I think it's just one. And you're like, oh, obviously it's his kid. Nope.
No.
nope, right back to the war. And then, you know, from the start, he's there for, I think they're there for like 29, 32 days. At the end, he goes back for a whole year. And you're just like, oh my God, dude, like there's the addiction. But what does that say? What does that mean, you know?
Well, I think they really, I mean, there is no doubt that Jeremy Renner's character in this is an adrenaline junkie. And I think the scene that really stands out that shows it is not any of the scenes in wartime, but it's when he's standing, walking along the grocery store aisles going, what's that? What's that? What's that? And you can really tell this life will bore him.
It will kill him.
Bore him to death. It will kill him. He cannot survive it. And there's another, and I don't know if this was Bigelow's intention, but I thought it was interesting. There's a scene where he breaks into the professor's house, trying to find Beckham.
Yes,
and
really crucial.
He walks in, he points the gun at the professor, and the professor offers him a seat, and he's like, no. And he says, "You're a guest. Sit." And he flinches at the word guest because Jeremy Renner, wherever war is, he considers war home, and he considers that to be
that's his comfort zone.
That's the comfort zone. That's where he should be as a person. And I think that ultimately shoots down a lot of the anti-war message of the movie because it's a little bit like, yeah, well, we got these guys and they gotta go to war, so fuck, we gotta have a war. Like it does kind of trip over this idea that's like he needs it and he's fundamentally broken and this is where he will survive and live. But it does trip over some of the anti-war nature.
Yeah. It's so true. That scene is, I think, a pivotal scene in terms of like just understanding his character more. But at the same time, it left me more confused than ever of like, what is this guy's purpose? And specifically, what is this scene meant to say about the whole thing, the whole film as a whole? Like, I think you're spot on with that of just like, it does kind of like blur the messages together a little bit. And because I feel like this movie does start off pretty anti-war, and then over time it just kind of like boils down to like just Jeremy Renner's character, and like it's no longer this big. It's not even really about the war at that point. It's just about what's going on. It's an internal war.
Yeah, it's the internal war he's fighting. But
yeah,
the issue is his answer for the internal war is war.
Yeah, yeah.
External war that is killing the Iraqi people, killing a lot of American servicemen, and they're not really acknowledging that. And you know what? Maybe people hear this podcast and come at me and are like, "Oh, you didn't watch that movie at all." Fair. There's a good chance I'm
happy
wrong.
To hear it. Yeah, I think I'm glad you said that because I do think this movie is open to so much interpretation. I think everyone can come away with a very different viewpoint and experience, and I think that's a good thing. I think I love when films do that. I think that's important, and that's like it's the whole reason we've got this podcast in the first place, is to have these types of discussions and hear different people's viewpoints and, you know, learn more about all of this stuff and just how people perceive it. So I that's something that I honestly do really like about this film, but then it does also make it very easy to criticize at the same time.
Yeah. Another thing that I think does, and I started this podcast by saying like, I really like Kathryn Bigelow. She did Point Break, one of my favorite movies. Another thing that does kind of shoot this movie's anti-war message in the knee is 3 years later, Kathryn Bigelow directs Zero Dark 30, which very entertaining movie. I like that movie as a movie. That movie lies about a lot of shit that's pretty not okay to lie about. So a big crux of that movie is and when it came out, it was controversial. And then over time, I believe it was this report was released after the movie was released, but a lot of that movie shows pretty graphic scenes of CIA torture of people that were either suspected or were generally involved in Al-Qaeda in some form of the operation. And some of them were like serious planners of the 9/11 attacks. But what that movie does is there's multiple comments about how the CIA feels entirely hindered by the Obama administration coming in, because the Obama administration promised to stop enhanced interrogation, which was the American torture, but it's not torture. Like waterboarding's torture, but like we don't consider it torture, so it's not torture.
Okay.
And that movie got a lot of flack, and especially has in later years, because none of the torture led to getting Osama bin Laden. That's not how we got Osama bin Laden. And the movie clearly portrays a lot of the torture done by the CIA as this, it's gross, it's grotesque, but it was necessary because it got us to the next step. That's not true.
So it's just like historically inaccurate.
It's historically inaccurate. Surveillance and bribes was how we got Osama bin Laden. A lot of surveillance, and like the most realistic scenes in that movie are the surveillance scenes and the scene where they give a guy a Lamborghini in exchange for an email. That was generally how we caught Osama bin Laden. And so I think Kathryn Bigelow as well gets kind of, after this movie, you got to give her a double glance, because
it's like, what
she
is
not
trying to say? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as a director, she's not opposed to painting the American wars in the Middle East as violent and brutal, but necessary. And that's kind of, over the years, especially as America has reflected on our time in Iraq and Afghanistan, that's becoming more glaring. And I think, give it 15, 20 years, Zero Dark 30 will be really frowned upon to watch, or not watch, but like will really not age well. And The Hurt Locker as well, I don't think will age as well.
So interesting. Yeah, I know. It'll be so interesting to see how we reflect on this, because obviously, you know, it won Best Picture. And that says something.
It was very well received.
Because we also know that, like, I mean, I feel like we all know that the Oscars are political, and they have been. So that's what I mean by it says something as well. Like, not even just saying like from a cinematic perspective, because obviously this is an incredible film in terms of like stylistics and all of that stuff. But you know, with that political aspect of the Oscars in mind, I think it's really interesting that this one, especially considering the films it was up against culturally, you know, like we were saying, everyone was rooting for Avatar. Everyone was like, this is a cinematic masterpiece.
Everyone thought Avatar was a shoo-in, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Like the Hurt Locker was like
putting up a good running, but
it was a shock.
I think it was a shock when Hurt Locker won.
Yeah. So I think that's really interesting as well. And like, I think there will be so much more commentary on this over the years, and like our perspective of it will change over the years as we watch it time and time again. So, but that is also like, you know, that's the power of cinema, man, right there.
Yeah. And I think it's good to have these different perspectives on it. And I think, I mean, I know my personal opinions will probably change over the next 5, 10, 15 years about these movies. I think it's good to evolve. And 5 years ago, like when I watched The Hurt Locker, I was just like, this is so intense and so badass, and I can't believe there are people out there that defuse bombs. Like, that's an insane,
it's a crazy job.
Objectively a selfless act.
I mean, you're inherently trying to prevent death and destruction. Which,
by putting your own body on the line.
Exactly.
And it does, frankly, just make great cinema, because goddamn, like, that is tense. You think it could go off at any time. Like, it's really good.
Those scenes are just so intense. I love them. I can't lie. Cinematically.
Cinematically, yes.
Yeah, I think we've touched on the anti-war for this. I think for me, there are still semblances of anti-war messages throughout it. But as a whole, I don't know if it hits perfectly. Especially, I think that the ending was kind of like the nail in the coffin for me. It's literally like a badass slow motion, him walking into battle, rock and roll. Yeah, and I was like, oh, this is just screaming like American warfare.
Yeah, I thought it really tripped over. I made a note about that where I was
Right?
like, "Whoa, this is
Bizarre
the
ending.
fucking badass. He's back."
Yeah,
and I was like, "All right, like, isn't the whole movie kind of like?"
No, that ending threw me so
Yeah.
much. I honestly don't think it fits with
No,
the rest of the
I
film.
thought the ending looked like a studio shoe-in.
It did. It's very confusing. It's very it just doesn't flow the way that the rest of the
No.
film I think really does flow, and everything kind of moves into the next kind of, because there's a lot of ideas that are pitched in this film as well. Even just like
Yeah.
touching on that whole thing with Beckham, the little kid, and Jeremy Renner's character, like when he does see that the kid is actually still alive, he brushes him off because he's
Yep.
just like, holy shit, that was like the straw that
That was
broke the camel's
traumatic.
back. Like he
and-
was like,
yeah.
that almost broke me. I almost like
Yeah.
couldn't keep doing this. Obviously, it's not worth it to build these relationships when they're at risk 24/7. So I thought that was a really interesting aspect as well, where it started to go in like a good direction of like humanizing all fronts and not, but then at the same time it just kept, it is all over the place. It would start to go in that direction and I'd be like, okay, yes, I see this, I'm understanding it, I'm following, and then backtrack, shoot itself in the foot a little bit. So, and then yeah, the ending, it just sealed the deal of like, what was that? What are we doing here?
Yeah, the ending. And like maybe there, I guess you could see the ending as like that's kind of what's going on in his mind.
I mean, yes,
like,
granted, because there
if you
is the
see it that
argument that
way-
this is about him more than the war.
Yeah, and how because if I remember correctly, I think he's in almost every scene.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Pretty
it's
much.
clearly from
I don't
his
think
point of
there's-
view.
I think, yeah, the opening scene is the only scene that he's
Yeah.
not in. Yeah.
So there's an argument that this is also a movie with an unreliable narrator.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, then I think a lot of my critiques are kind of wrong.
I mean, yeah. But then there's also that scene where like Mackie's character is like, I'm gonna accidentally kill this guy.
oh yeah, when they're gonna frag him, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, and that
So there
Jeremy
are-
Renner couldn't have known that.
There are, but
That's
at
true.
the same time, we are almost seeing it through their perspective. Like we're kind of just watching his distant figure fumble
Yeah.
along in the danger zone for his gloves that he left.
Yep.
Just trying to get a hit of adrenaline, basically.
Yep.
And they're just fed up at this point. They're like, this is bullshit. So I don't know. That's why I think, like I said, I think this is very much open to interpretation, and different viewpoints are all valid because there's just so much to unpack in this film as well.
Yeah.
So
I also, this is a bit of a sidebar, but on a note on the casting,
yeah.
every time I watch this movie, Ray Fiennes kind of seems out of place.
Oh, I forgot. Every single time I forget that he's in this film.
I've hit a point where now I remember it because I used to be just so jarring. Like, fuck, what is Voldemort doing in the desert?
Okay, literally, that was my thoughts exactly. I was like, I hear his Voldemort voice.
Yeah, and like I think Ray Fiennes has a lot of range.
Oh,
and
I
he's a
love
really
him.
Good actor.
Yes.
The Grand Budapest is incredible.
I was just
in
gonna
this
say,
one
yeah.
scene, I was like, what are we doing with him? And like
It's
he's just like
odd.
this fucked up private military contractor. He's got all of his targets are on playing cards.
Yeah, it's sickening behavior.
Yeah, and he's just clearly a sociopath. And then
Yep.
I remember when he pops up on screen every time. I'm like,
What are we doing?
they coulda. I don't know if Ray Fiennes was the guy to get for this.
I agree, only because he is such a great actor that you almost expect him to play more of a role than he does. And so it's like, you know, that's something that's interesting in filmmaking as well in terms of casting, is like,
I guess
this
the thing I don't
cameo
believe about
didn't
him-
work. This big cameo didn't work.
The thing I don't totally believe about him is I don't believe him being rough around the edges. But yeah, no, I just, when I saw him, I was like, that doesn't strike me as a private military contractor that's just going after bounties for money in the desert.
I think rough around the edges was the perfect way to describe
Yeah.
it. Like, he's just a little too clean cut to be out there.
Exactly.
And, like,
too clean
it
cut,
just-
too
yeah.
exacting.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it doesn't ruin the movie. He's in there for like 5 minutes and then
Yeah.
he just gets sniped.
It's kind of just an odd cameo is how.
Yeah, just like, oh, hey, Ray Fiennes.
Yeah, it's like, oh, I love that guy. And then
Yeah.
by the time you've clocked it, he's gone. So you're just like, oh, moving on.
I like to imagine that if you're lost in the desert, Ray Fiennes does appear to you, though.
that would be amazing. We can only hope. Oh, I love it. Well, any final thoughts on The Hurt Locker?
I think I was definitely able to get my opinions out on The Hurt Locker. One quick final thing was I totally forgot they don't defuse the bomb at the end that's on the guy
I
on the
fucking
cage.
hate that scene.
And so my note is this kind of validates everything in the movie if he saves the last hostage with the bomb. And then I have a second note under that that's got like an arrow pointing to it that says, lol, forgot the guy still blew up. So I did think that was a bit of if there was a nod to like maybe this war is a waste of time, maybe this is all for nothing. It's the fact that the guy that is clearly innocent, and they establish so heavily that he's innocent.
So many times. Yeah.
If the innocent guy still dies and they weren't able to get him, what's the point?
What's the point?
And so I thought that might actually be where Kathryn Bigelow was like, here's my anti-war stance.
Yeah, and I think it worked because for me, I hate that scene so much. And it's because it's so horrific and, you know, you're watching. And I think also what comes into play there is that, in my opinion, Jeremy Renner's character does not exist in real life. I think he's very much movified, if you will.
Oh, yeah. There's a comment that says, how many bombs have you disarmed? And he's like, about 838. I was like, holy shit. Like, if you do the math on how many bombs a day that is, that's insane.
Yeah. And even just like the way he carries himself, like it's
a bomb every 2.5 days.
It's unrealistic. And so
for that time.
Yeah, exactly. And so like it's unrealistic. And so then it's like you are looking for a happy ending almost because you're just like, we've been following this for so long and it's gritty, but it may not be the most realistic. You know what I'm saying? And so yeah, that scene it really like spins you on your head watching this because it's so unexpected. And then I also think it's really interesting, like after that, he like turns around Jeremy Renner's character turns around as it blows up and he falls back from the explosion. And then he looks up and he sees like a kite being flown by a kid. Yeah. And I was really just like, what does that mean? Like, what is that scene for? What is going through his mind? And for a second, I was like, oh, maybe it comes back to his kid and he's thinking about his kid.
Yeah.
But then as soon as he returns to his kid, he returns back to the bombs, to the war. Yeah. So that just like was so confusing to me. I'm really curious. Listeners out there, if you guys have an answer, please let me know because honestly, I was very confused by that, but it felt significant in that moment of the film. Oh man, this movie is a wild ride, especially watched through our theme lens today.
Oh yeah.
But overall, I still think it's really I think it'll be an important film in cinematic history, and I think it'll be interesting, very interesting to continue watching it in the future and seeing just like we were saying how it is perceived over the years as we get further and further away from this event in our history. So definitely check it out. You guys can rent it on Amazon Prime along with all of the other films we watched today, Full Metal Jacket, Jarhead. Let us know what you guys think. We're really excited to hear your thoughts on all of this. And yeah, that's a wrap on our episode today. Matt, thank you so much for joining me again on the Gimme Three podcast. It was a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure and an honor to join.
Oh, of
I hope
course.
I didn't yap too long.
Are you kidding me? That's what this is for. It was so much fun. And thank you to all our listeners for tuning in. We're so grateful for all of your support. We hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and we hope we've inspired you to check out these films. Please let us know if you agree, you disagree with our takes, what you guys got from these films. We're really excited to hear what you think. You can comment your thoughts on our Instagram page at Gimme Three Podcast. That's GIMME, spell out 3 podcast. Give us a follow while you're there, and you guys can stay up to date on all upcoming content. You can also reach us through our super cool texting feature. Hit the send us a text link at the top of our episode description, and we'll share your text on the podcast if you want. You guys can find me on Instagram at Portrait of a Cinephile or on Letterboxd at Bella Efstratis. Once again, thank you so much for tuning in to the Gimme Three podcast, and we'll see you at the movies.